Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Welcome back to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. Before we hear from our speaker, it's our tradition to go around and introduce ourselves first. Just by a show of hands, is there anyone here for the first time or returning after a long absence? Welcome. We'll try and especially remember your names as we go around. My name is Tom.
I'm Len.
Max. I'm Kay.
Harvey.
Benjamin. Sorry.
My name is Ed.
Donald.
Lee.
Jose.
My name is Harley. I'm Jack.
I'm Joe.
I'm Richard.
I'm Al.
Peter.
My name is Oswaldo.
I'm Grisha.
I'm George.
I'm Brad. Jeff.
My name is Cass. My name is Paul.
George.
Craig.
Kevin.
I'm Gary. Corey. I'm Joe.
I'm Michael.
Scott. Mark.
Juan.
Michael. I'm Jerry.
Jim. William.
I'm Clint.
My name is Mark.
And Pat.
Great. Today, our speaker is Benjamin Young. Benjamin began meditation as part of his spiritual practice when he was in his early 20s. Over the last 40 years, he has studied many spiritual paths, pursued a number of meditation practices, led spiritual retreats, and given spiritual talks. Benjamin traveled to India for 2 months in 2001, where he took monk's vows. He has been practicing a Buddhist form of meditation called Anapanasati, the mindfulness of the in and out breath, for the past 20 years, and assisting others in developing their spiritual practices. Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to have such a wonderful host here. I've been sort of wandering in and out of San Francisco and San Francisco Sanghas for a long time. I live in San Jose, so that sort of presents a barrier to coming up here and spending time. But I've done a couple of the retreats here, and I'd recommend them. They're quite wonderful. And most of the people I've encountered here have been really wonderful people as well. Some sort of housekeeping. I always carry a picture with me of who I say is my teacher, and this is Ramana Maharshi, who was a Hindu saint who died in 1950. He died 2 years after I was born, so it wasn't somebody that I got to really meet, but he certainly had an impact on my life, and I'm going to be referencing him occasionally as I talk. And to begin with, I have a little quote from him regarding teachers. He said, "He who instructs an ardent seeker to do this or that is not a true master. The seeker is already afflicted by his activities and wants peace and rest. In other words, he wants cessation of his activities. Instead of that, he is told to do something in addition to or in place of his other activities. Can that be a help to a seeker? Activity is creation. Activity is the destruction of one's inherent happiness. If activity be advocated, the advisor is not a master, but a killer. Either the creator or death may be said to have come in the guise of such a master. He cannot liberate the aspirant, but strengthens his fetters." And the reason I wanted to sort of read that is because I want you to understand that I'm going to give you some information about what I've done with my life and what's happened in my practice. And I'd like you just to sort of look at that take out of it what might be useful and discard what isn't. I think that the problem is we develop attachments, and there's a natural tendency to develop an attachment for teachers because they inspire us. They reflect what we think would be really good for us to be, and those pose hindrances in our practice. One of the great advantages for me is that I never had the opportunity of attaching to my teacher. He was always there to support me in lots of ways, but not in ways that were sort of physical bodies. So as we sort of work through this dialogue, because I'd like to dialogue with you a bit, keep that in mind. So I'm not advocating what I say, I'm just saying it as an expression of my perspective. When I was sitting here during the meditation, I was practicing sort of a mantra. Is everyone familiar with what a mantra is? The mantra I was practicing was, get out of the way. Because when you get to sit down and try to present something to others, the first thing that happens is you start considering how you're being perceived. And that's a really amazing hindrance, because it means that the information that you have to present doesn't come across as clearly as it could. It gets filtered through all of the feelings and emotions and desires that reflect those aspects of who we are. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I think it would be really wonderful if you could have heard the talks that I've organized in my head since I agreed to sort of do this, because they're probably much better than what you're going to get. Which is the other nature of sort of being human, and that is that our minds tend to proliferate a lot. And certainly, since I've had several months to think about being here, it's done a lot of proliferation. On the other side, it's also done a lot of organizing. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a benefit for everyone here, but it's a great benefit for me, because it's a checkpoint in what's going on in my life. I have the opportunity to sort of look at where I've been, where I think I'm at now, and really where I think I would like to go. And even though there really isn't anything other than this particular moment to be in, those are aspects of the way the human mind works. And since I spend most of my time occupying that, I guess I'm going to have to play that game as well. Excuse me. One of the reasons that I came here to talk was to give you some insight into some aspects of meditation that I spend a lot of time dealing with. And to do that, I'd like to ask a few questions to get a couple of responses. One, how many people here meditate daily? How many people find that to be a rewarding experience? Now, would somebody be bold enough as to tell me why they find that a rewarding experience?
Well, it just makes you more aware of just how my mind wanders all the time, and it's interesting to have like a half hour where I can really try to focus it instead of just letting it do its thing.
How do you do that?
I focus on something. I meditate with my eyes open. I focus on something, and I just really try to keep my attention focused on it. And when it wanders, I bring it back to focusing on the object again.
So you're applying a tool.
Yeah.
And the tool you're applying is probably mindfulness. Being aware of what's happening.
Yeah, I would call it mindfulness.
Okay, well, the Buddha talked a lot about mindfulness. It was one of the two major tools that he incorporated into his meditation technique.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it also it lets me see how unmindful I am. So, well, I mean, that's a valuable lesson to know too.
Right. Well, noticing unmindfulness is mindfulness. It's a great observation. Anyone else?
I find it very clarifying and centering. I mean, when I meditate, my perspective is that I have in my mind lots of thoughts, memories, things that were subjective perceptions that are often the basis of decisions that I make. They're very often not the best decisions. When I can quiet the mind, there's a deeper, calmer place that's, I think, feels a little more authentically to me than all the stuff running out of my mind. When I can rest there, it helps me gain a perspective on priorities and what I think I really want to do and how I have to manage, just one thing or the other. And when you meditate often enough, sometimes during a difficult time, you can sort of like go back to that place.
So what you've done is you've defined the other component the Buddha talked a lot about. He said that there were two things that were really essential for developing a practice. One was mindfulness, the second was concentration. Concentration is really bringing one's focus down to the point where we have an opportunity really to sort of open a space to examine what's happening. And I think that's what you were talking about. Okay, another question. What do you hope to accomplish out of the meditative practice? What's your goal? Is it something that you just do, or is there a more profound reason that you might be doing it?
Well, as I said, it's to be more mindful, to try to train myself to be more in the present moment.
Okay. Another thing Ramana said, his perspective was that the goal of practice was realization. And that gets expressed in a lot of different perspectives depending on where you're sort of sitting from a spiritual view or a religious view. His view was that realization is to get rid of the delusion that you have not realized. So basically, he thought that people lived in deluded states, that they really weren't aware of the reality of what they were or who they were. So he encouraged people to follow one of two basic pathways. One was a pathway of devotion, which isn't utilized so much in Buddhism, yet it is utilized because certainly in the Tibetan traditions, devotion is a very major part of what goes on. And the other aspect is investigation, or wisdom, you could define it as being. And that is really sort of searching and understanding those aspects that go on that make us what we are, and to eventually drill down to the point of understanding who we are. His primary focus is one of self-investigation and inquiring into who he is, or who am I. So the meditative process involved asking the question, who am I? But it didn't just involve sitting there and saying, okay, now, who am I? It involved creating a state where when you ask the question, it's possible for you to not necessarily intellectualize an answer, but actually experience an answer. And it's a very different thing, We live in a culture that is so externally oriented that it's very hard for us to sort of grasp sort of this deep exploration, which excludes all the exterior processes that we're so involved in. And that was pretty much the way he taught. In my life experience, probably is similar to most of the people here in some ways. In other ways it isn't. I grew up in this country. I grew up in a small agricultural community. I grew up on a farm. I grew up in a very conservative area. I came from a family that had its roots in Catholicism, except that my mother was Southern Baptist, which added a nice twist to it. So people who have incompatibilities seem to find ways of fitting together, which meant that my religious basis was really sort of non-existent because there was conflict between, particularly, the Southern Baptist and the Catholic Church. They didn't really get along very well. But there was a sense of spirituality that I acquired from somewhere. And it was a belief that, there were certain ways that I should be and certain things that I should accomplish in my life. I never really got a handle on what the roots of those were. But when I look back on it, one of the things I recognize is that early on in my childhood, I wasn't there. I didn't really come into existence until probably I was 3 or 4 years old. At those points, I could really sort of begin to understand that there was a me and there was a world around me, and that there was a separation between those two things. And that was sort of the beginning of the process. Prior to that, events occurred, and there might be some memory of them, but there's not memory really in association with that center called me. As I went through high school and as I went to college, I developed a very sort of optimistic view of the world. And what I discovered was that it really wasn't quite as catering to optimism as I thought it was. It was, there was a major disappointment about the time I hit college that the world really didn't quite work the way I thought it was supposed to. And that produced a very rebellious state in me, and I became very active. It was a very rebellious time in this country because it was the late 60s, early 70s. And for me, that meant that I had to go off and in some way make the world different. So I went off to become a radical, a political radical, to engage in activity that probably would be borderline unacceptable to middle-class America, in fact was, and rebelled against the military activities of the country at that time. And discovered that most of the people who were rebelling were just angry people. And I was probably upset, but I didn't feel as angry as most of the people I met. And I realized that they were angry because basically the same reason. The world really didn't work quite the way they thought it was supposed to based on where they had come from, based on what they had learned. We get sort of an optimistic education and we move into a more pessimistic world, and this sort of requires a lot of adaptation. If you're not automatically trapped in the system where all of a sudden you discover that you have dependents you have to take care of and everything else, you have this wonderful opportunity to sort of mull all this over and to contend with it a bit. And then you sort of get involved in trying to establish relationships and all the other aspects that are part of being human and part of living in a culture and a society. And I engaged in those activities. I became more active in the gay community, looking for partners, not necessarily succeeding, maybe succeeding a little, having that breakup, moving on, all the things that we encounter. And slowly growing older and suddenly discovering that maybe I had more ability to have perspective, which was changeable than I'd realized. I could actually look at the world from more than one position. In other words, I was more flexible than I had realized when I was 20. And that flexibility was sort of intriguing for me. Running in parallel, I was attempting to develop a spiritual practice, which started when I was in my 20s, coming from a radical place, encountering an obscure reference to an Indian saint named Ramana Maharshi, who intrigued me enough to want me to investigate religion. And it wasn't religion in the sense of traditional religion. It was more in the sense of spirituality. So I began a meditative practice. I looked at Zen, which was incomprehensible. There was nothing about it that made any sense to me. And from my perspective, everything had to make sense. Everything had to fit together. I was a rational person. I grew up in a scientific age. So if it didn't fit, and I couldn't figure out how to make it fit, then it probably wasn't acceptable. Zen didn't fit. So I moved on and looked at Christian mysticism. It didn't fit. I looked at Hinduism. It didn't fit. But each one gave me some piece to sort of integrate into my spiritual perspective. And as I was doing this integration, there was a slow increasing in flexibility in what I was willing to accept and what I was less willing to reject, I suppose, about my spiritual practices. So along with putting myself in the middle of the gay community, which was, in a sense, at that point, outside the mainstream, developing spiritual perspective that was, in a sense, outside the mainstream, I learned how to really sort of adapt. And as my practice evolved, my adaptability increased. And the result was that I finally began to realize that it wasn't particularly important whether it made sense or not. It didn't have to conform to what I thought were acceptable parameters. And the result was that I began to look more at what Ramana had said about self-inquiry. And I began to understand that the question that was being asked was not one of who am I in the sense of how do I define myself, but who am I beyond the sense of how I define myself. Since I define myself generally in terms of the way I fit into the world, the way I behave, the way I respond, the way I question, then the question that he thought I should be asking is, what is there beyond that level? So when I began to engage in Anapanasati, which is a wonderful practice, by the way, it gives you a natural way of focusing. The natural way is you look at the breath and you observe it in detail, and you maintain mindfulness and you develop concentration. After you've maintained mindfulness and you develop concentration, you reach the point where you have to decide what you're going to do with those tools. So you begin to look at concentration in a different sense from the way we normally look at it. Concentration for us is we have something to accomplish, so therefore we focus on it so we can get it done. In a sense, that's a very productive thing, but in a sense, it's not the same way that I think the Buddha was talking about concentration or Ramana was talking about concentration. He was talking about developing the quality of concentration and maintaining it, being concentrated. Not on something, but just being concentrated. And also using this wonderful thing we have called mindfulness to be sort of a gate guarder, because we're continually bombarded by information coming in from 6 different sources. We have 5 senses that feed us information about what's going on in the world continuously, and we have a mind that's really wonderful at generating information when we're not focused on the 5 senses. Concentration means that you can abide in a space, and mindfulness means that you can guard the doorways so that those 6 entry points aren't feeding information into that concentrated space. And if you can do that, you actually begin to have some rather interesting experiences. And the Buddha talked about those experiences as one aspect of his teachings. Generally what's happened over time is the Buddhist teachings have really sort of broken off into 2 pathways. One pathway is the pathway of developing concentration. The other pathway is the pathway of developing mindfulness. I think the Buddha really meant for those 2 tools to be developed and to be applied together to look at what's happening in our lives and our practices and to gain insight. So if you take the concentration and you just allow it to be there and you're guarding the gates, you begin to have experiences of deeper and deeper levels of concentration. Things that we don't normally experience when we're doing focused work concentration. And he defined them as being the Jahnic states. And actually he talked about meditation as being, for example, Vipassana jhana, which means mindfulness concentration rather than just mindfulness. And he talked about shamatha jhana, which was really concentrated focus or concentration. So what are the different kinds of states that we experience when we're dealing with deepening concentration? What is, for example, the first of the 4 jhanas? Well, it's probably something most people have experienced, and that is really being able to sustain for a period of time concentration on a single object. And he said there are other qualities that begin to appear when you experience that. And I did some research and pulled out some definitions just to He said the first jhana is having the 5 following factors: noting, the ability to recognize; experiencing, being in the moment; rapture, which is a physical pleasure; joy, which is a mental pleasure; and one-pointedness. He said when those factors appear and can be sustained, you've reached a level of primary concentration at the first jhanic state. And then he goes on to describe the second, third, and fourth jhanic state. The interesting thing about it is that the states are not an acquisition. It's not like we get something. What happens is we keep getting rid of something. Second jhanic state has less factors. Third jhanic state has less factors. Fourth jhanic state is basically what we would call equanimity, or just being in the moment. The physical joy, the mental joy, those other aspects of concentration have, in a sense, left, or our focus has gone beyond those to the point where we're now just abiding in the moment. So now, if we go back and look at what I said Ramana's search was, and that is one of asking the question, who am I? You're really getting an answer in the process. What's happening is our beliefs about who we are slowly dissipating until there's nothing left but an abidance. And that abidance is an experience of who we are. And that's why the Buddha felt that the jhanic states were useful. Not because having experienced it, one had, in a sense, gained realization, but that by experiencing it, one has an opportunity to know what it's like. Just because you've had that experience doesn't mean that it's a sustainable experience. It still requires the structure of your practice in order to attain it. But at least you've had the opportunity of knowing, in a sense, what the goal of being who you are really is. So, when I look at meditation, I view it as being a collection of tools that I can apply to my practice, which give me insight into how I can strengthen my daily activities to support the insight into who and what I am. Does anyone have any comments?
So have you experienced these states?
The jhanic states? Yeah, the jhanic states aren't difficult to experience. Now Harvey's laughing. And they are. One of the qualities that I have is that I'm really, really stubborn. And it requires, for me that's been useful because it means that I'm determined in a sense. Stubbornness is really an extreme form of being determined. So for me it was something that I kept working with for a long time until I began to have those kinds of experiences. Having experienced them, I haven't really gained anything other than just having had the experience.
I have this wanting you to say more about these states. Do you want to get back to them?
There's always a desire to want to get back to them. It's the first thing that you deal with. Because having the desire automatically blocks your having the experience. So, having acquired it, it's something that you're going to let go of. There are, by the way, 4 additional states, which are called the higher states. And they're much more interesting and challenging. I'll give you the formal definitions. The first higher state is an experience of infinite space. The second higher state is an experience of infinite consciousness. The third higher state is an experience of infinite nothingness. And the fourth higher state is an experience that is neither experience nor non-experience. That's what I love about the whole thing. You know, just
I've got to say, you thought Zen didn't I?
Are those hierarchical? Are those four? Those last four?
Again, it goes back to each one is a lessening.
Yes.
You know, it means that the level of concentration as it increases tends to, first of all, eliminate the aspects of the world we live in that tend to bombard us with information. And the higher states, even though they're a lessening, are an expansiveness. It's a recognition that this I-ness that we're talking about is not a limited aspect, but an expansive aspect. So it's moving from feeling separate in the world to eliminating the separateness, to feel expansive not in the world, but you might say in consciousness.
And the Buddha say it was progressive, or that it was just you moved around from one to the other?
No, generally you can't sort of, suddenly end up in the higher state. Generally these are markers for experience. They're not goals. They're really, and it's one of the important things that I learned as I spent a lot of time reading. And one of the things I learned was that it's hard to sit down and take a book, open it up, use it as a cookbook for what you're going to accomplish. But that it's really nice to go back and look at it after you've had an experience to help clarify what that experience was. And I began to have experiences of what are defined as the Jahnic states before I knew what they were. And the result was that when I began to look at them, it gave me some indication that somebody else had had similar experiences and actually sort of defined those. One of the fascinating things about the Jahnic states that really sort of struck me was I read a book by a really excellent meditation teacher who described the Jahnic states as experiences which he couldn't describe because he had no awareness of them when he was experiencing them. And that didn't make any sense to me at all. Then I went back and read something that Ramana had talked a lot about, and he talks about 3 states. He talks about being awake, he talks about dreaming, he talks about deep sleep. And he says that I'm present when I'm awake because I experience everything. I'm present in my dreams because I'm experiencing everything. But where am I in the deep sleep? What happened to me? I go to sleep, I have a deep sleep, I wake up the next morning, I'm there, and I was there when I went to sleep. But where did I go while I was sleeping? Well, the reality is that the I that we think we are was there when we were awake, was there when we were dreaming, but wasn't there when we were in deep sleep. And that I is the one that we have defined ourselves as being. That's sort of the holographic image we maintain that represents who we think we are. He's saying that there's, in a sense, another I that's not so separate. In fact, he says the other I really isn't separate at all. The other I is everything. And the reason that we don't experience it is because we're so stuck in the belief that we're this I that lives in the world, lives in the body, that when that I loses consciousness, we don't exist anymore. So one of the great challenges I confronted as I evolved through my spiritual processes was that I had this thing stuck somewhere that I called God, because it had been deeply embedded in me when I was a child. And somehow I had to make that fit into what worked for me today, because even though I can change, I don't change quickly. So for me it was easy to say, okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that label and I'm going to sort of stick it on to this all-pervading consciousness. And I'll let that be God. That consciousness that continues to be there whether I'm awake or whether I'm asleep, but I'm not aware of when I'm awake, and obviously the awake me isn't aware of when I'm asleep, is God. And by the way, that happens to be who I am. So that means that, in a sense, I'm just everything. Everything is just a manifestation of my mind. When I'm awake, I create the divisions, the separations, all the perspectives. And when I'm in deep sleep, there's just consciousness, which doesn't have any of those rules, doesn't have any of those games. Sorry.
Do you think today in our meditation that we went to a deep sleep and became us the other eye? Because I had this thing where we're meditating and I kind of go, wow, this is so amazing just to say everybody's just meditating but not really being in the regular eye.
It's sort of the regular eye looking at the situation and saying, okay, this is another aspect. It's another component of what I am. It's when I looked at Tibetan tradition, it came down to being two components, wisdom and compassion. Wisdom was pretty easy for me to comprehend because it means, sort of acquiring insight, understanding. Compassion was much more difficult. Until I began to view compassion as being unity. It's sort of, realization that everything is. And not going beyond that, just everything is, So how can you go out and observe suffering when that suffering is just an aspect of isness, which we all are, which means it's really my suffering. And that began to help me understand, really, to fit that component into my perspective as well. And again, it's part of my nature. I have to fit everything together and make it, sort of work for me. So
I'm trying to appreciate more your integration of the Vipassana and concentration and mindfulness. And so I understand that as the Jahnic states increase and there's the cessation of these different aspects, that you, as you said at one point, the concentration is a concentration on a thing. You become more concentrated in a state of I-ness.
Right, so it really is selflessness.
Uh-huh.
You might call it a no-self state.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha talks a lot about no-self. I think the difficult aspect is that, people get hung up into looking at this and going, okay, now I have a pathway. I can do this, 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 and this, and then when I get there, I have this. The reality is that all you have is a tool. You have to turn around and apply the tool, not only in your meditative practice, but you have to begin to apply the tool as much as you can on a moment-by-moment basis in your life. When you reach the point where that application becomes a continuous process, then you've reached what Ramana would call a realized state. And certainly we have a lot pushing us not to do that. We have a history. You can take the word history and you can go to India and they'll give you a word called karma, and you can put them together and realize that they're the same thing. Our history is our karma. Our habitual behaviors are karma, which is a result of our history. But it's not only the history of the events that have occurred since the time we were here. We have a genetic history, which is also our karma. All of those things impose constraints on us because they help to define who we are. And they're essential constraints because you can't function in this world without those constraints. But the fact is, you can actually set them aside.
These vasanas.
And the reason you practice is it gives you an opportunity to really sit down and to set them aside. You can be in the moment. You can be free.
What role do you think entheogenics can serve in experiencing these states?
I'm not familiar with that. What?
Hallucinogenics.
Oh, hallucinogenics.
Jim Stewart's not here, so I think I
Having a great history of hallucinogenics, I think that there comes a point where they can increase your flexibility, the flexibility of view. For me, that happened, in my early mid-20s, it helped me sort of break down some of my rigid perspectives. I think that if you continue to utilize them, that they become a major hindrance, because I think that they produce a counterstate which is inflexible. The belief that there become essential components for you to experience
a crutch.
Right. And I don't think that's a particularly useful place. One of the things that age and time give us is the potential for wisdom. And wisdom is the ultimate flexibility. There's nothing greater than recognizing when you're sitting there looking at something that there's another view. One of the difficulties in my life is I've struggled with depression. And I was talking with my mother the other day, and I said, I'm experiencing some depression. And her response was, what are you depressed about? And my response was, nothing. I said, depression is not about being depressed. They're not the same thing. Depression is a state that you experience. I said, if you're flexible enough, you can recognize when depression begins to occur, and you can actually do things by changing the way you view stuff. That's the flexibility of having the wisdom to recognize that we have potential for many, many views.
But she sees it as cause and effect. This happened, you got depressed.
Right. And it's not that way. I mean, it probably is. They're probably triggering factors or what have you. But they're not what we would typically call triggering factors, like some event came along that was really negative that happened. They don't even have to be negative events. It's just what we deal with. And I've never used medications to deal with depression, and I spend most of my life being depression-free because I can detect the onset of depression so early that I can actually compensate for it. And that's what we should learn to do. In our culture, the solution is you give somebody a pill, and it cuts off everything. Not only do you not get depressed, but you never get happy. You're just sort of sitting in the middle. It's a middle state, and it's not a wonderful place.
Well, there are all different types of depression. I believe some of it is just brain chemistry, and so I've had a history of depression, and I have pharmacological solutions that have just really made my life much better because of that.
Absolutely.
So I know I've got other causes of depression with other people, but for me, I think it was my brain lacked a certain chemical that the medication provided.
No, I agree with you. But I think, actually one of the things is that we don't have an opportunity really to learn how to produce those chemicals ourselves in our brains. Because the solution is so quick in fact, medication has become sort of the ultimate solution. And I think that's useful, but it should be applied with training at the same time, with education and ways of strengthening you. Meditation is a great tool to deal with depression.
So you spent a lot of time studying and practicing and investigating. I'm curious about, 15 years ago, you spent a lot of time reading and you traveled, and that was quite a different, taking you out of your books and your reading and studying into a whole other world.
Right.
And also about your experience becoming a monk. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and also how it added to your understanding of where you are today?
Yeah, Harvey's very familiar with this because he and I went to India together to do this. When I looked at my spiritual practice, I decided it needed a jolt. It's easy to become settled. You do the same thing over and over and over, and I'd reached the point where I just felt like it was becoming stale. So I decided that what I would do was I would commit myself to a more structured practice. That was my monkdom. But I recognized that I couldn't go out and be like a Buddhist monk or a Christian monk for a couple of reasons. One is none of those perspectives really fit mine. So it would have been stupid for me to go and just try to take on somebody else's perspective. And secondly, I was too old. No monastic community wants an old person to come and join them. They become a burden too quickly. So we decided we would sort of go off to India and take vows, which we wrote ourselves. And we decided that we wanted to do that in Tiruvannamalai where Ramana was, not because we thought he was going to be our guru or anything like that, but because I respected him and I thought it would be a nice place to take vows. What I learned from India was that the world is an entirely different place once you step outside of what you experience as the normal world. India is great for teaching you that because when you go there, nothing works the way you think it should. And Harvey and I had, forgive me for telling this, Harvey, Harvey and I had different experiences.
Totally different.
I went off to India, and when I reached Ramana's place, I got a wonderful boost because I had this great experience of being free, being unburdened. And I got to travel around India, and it really didn't matter where I was or what was going on. I was just there, and I was there for the entire trip, just having experiences. It was great. Harvey was really struggling with trying to make India do what he thought India should be doing. So he had not so pleasant a trip. And he also spent a lot of time being angry with me because he didn't like the fact that I wasn't suffering along with him.
And I'm suffering.
And that's what's nice about India. I mean, that's what you learn, as for, what India teaches. There's wonderful wisdom in India, but there's also wonderful wisdom here if you can tap into it. And for me, again, it was a way of changing my practice and making a commitment and making a more open statement, like saying I'm gay. Being a monk is like saying I'm gay. It was a statement of where I wanted to be perceived as being and what I wanted to accomplish with my life.
So it's a wonderful experience, I'm sure. But so you didn't go to a place and have some structure with teachers or people or a place. You just were your own university of monk.
What we did was we went to this particular place. We had planned on being there on December 31st, 2001. 2001. 2000, to be there 2001, which was the beginning of the millennium. We had taken what we called preliminary vows on December 31st, 2000, so we spent a year preparing.
With Kevin.
Kevin was there when we made this vow to do. And we climbed a mountain. We got into a cave that Ramana had sat in for 17 years, and we took our vows there. And then we came out and we traveled in India as what are called sannyasins, wandering monks, which meant we couldn't be anywhere for more than 3 days, because if you stay somewhere for more than 3 days, you've taken root. You're no longer a wandering monk. So we spent 2 months traveling around India, continuously moving for 5,000 miles. So, yeah, we were our own decision makers, but we had lots of support in the sense that we had our own histories, our own spiritual histories as the foundation for what our monkdom was going to be. Yeah.
So thank you. I found the things you said to be very true in my experience or perception. And I was interested in further asking about connections between a couple of them, between consciousness and concentration and deep dream state. And I've struggled, probably isn't the word, I've wondered about what is consciousness, which as far as I know, nobody knows.
Right.
And we only have about a minute left.
Okay, I wondered if this was one of the absence issues, that maybe concentration and deep sleep are both non-consciousness, or at least non-self-consciousness, if that's how it might fit.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that we look for a way of defining everything. That's the way our mind works.
Sure.
And consciousness is not something that is definable, but it is something that we can experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in deep sleep you experience that profound consciousness because it's an undefined state. It's confusing to us. because we want to be able to say, okay, this is what it is, and this is what it feels like. And I think when you reach the point that I was talking about in this fourth Jahnic state, where you're really experiencing equanimity, there's no self-view anymore. And you really begin to recognize that the transition is from one of self-view to non-self-view. And that's the lesson. That's how the tool gets used. And that's why it's not a realization state or an enlightened state, but it is a useful state. Okay? Thank you.
Benjamin, thank you so much. Next week our speaker will be Prasada Chitta Dharmachari, who sits with us periodically. He's an ordained member of the Triratna Buddhist community. He teaches meditation, yoga, and Buddhism here at the San Francisco Buddhist Center. So come and listen to him next week. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. It's what sustains our Sangha. We do have expenses, including renting this space, our newsletter, our website, our outreach to runaway youth and homeless once a month. And so suggested donation is $10. Our host will be coming around with the Dana bowl, and if you don't see him, please make sure you find the Dana bowl before you go. But whatever you can donate is certainly welcome. Do we have a host?
I'm your host. Looks like there was a little mix-up today, and we actually have two hosts, so there's ample treats, including some homemade cookies from Richard, in addition to other things I brought. I will be coming around with the Dana bowl. There's hot tea available. If you use, there's cups in the little kitchenette there. If you do use the tea, just wash your cup and put it on the rack to dry. If you want to be on the mailing list, put on your physical and email address on the sign-up list. And some of us meet for lunch after at 12:30 at the door. I think that's everything.
Yes.
As your treasurer, I mentioned this last week, I have the financials for last year. If anyone's interested in having
I'm Cass. I'm your mixed-up coordinator of hosts. And I'd like to share with you an exciting opportunity. We have a rare opening for a regular host to take over one of the slots, which involves a commitment of one Sunday every 2 months. And it's a great way to be of service to the Sangha. And if anybody might be interested in pursuing that, please talk to me afterwards in the social hall.
And I have one ticket for the this coming Wednesday's performance of A Lie of the Mind by Sam Shepard. And I really ages myself. I saw it when it was new 30 years ago. And it's a very, very, very exciting movie.
Where's it playing?
Playing at Magic Theater.
Yeah. I just want to remind everyone, GBF has an account at Community Thrift, which is 17th in Valencia, so if you have anything that you don't need and want to get rid of, it's a great way to support the Sangha because we get a cut of the sale price. It's averaging like $300 or $400 a quarter, so.
One just showed up this week, a check from them.
Excellent.
Of some amount. Jack?
Every other month I usually make, on the last Sunday of the month, an announcement about the newsletter. And today would have been our regular time, except we now have a new editor, Brian Backus, and we're changing from bi-monthly to quarterly. So the next newsletter will be coming out 3 weeks from today on the 22nd. So that's just a little coordination announcement.
So when is the next 3-month period begin? I didn't quite get, so we're getting the newsletter to...
It will go out the end of February for March, April, and May.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and so in our social period, please try and make welcome our newcomers Ed, Corey, Craig, and Kevin. Or have you been here before?
I haven't been here.
Well, you're new too. Did I miss anyone? Did I miss anyone? Okay. Why don't we gather in a circle for our dedication of merit? So, keeping in mind those who lost their homes and their livelihood last Wednesday in the fire on this block, let us invoke, by the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.